Hello, friends and viewers. It is your friendly Empyrean Serpent, and I am here today with the top 100 metal releases from 2019, aka last year, and today we will be covering albums numbered 30 to 11, saving the top 10 for the next video. I would recommend going ahead and checking out the rest of this list, as there were a ton of great releases from this year, but without further ado, let's get this started. So, at number 30 here we have Apophenia by Hans Grossmann, a solo album by an extremely technically proficient percussionist who has worked in tons of amazing bands including Necrophagist, Obscura, Blotted Science, Alkaloid, Eternity's End, Howling Sycamore, and a decent few more. And if you've listened to any of those other albums, you can probably tell that he is an incredibly skilled player, which evidently carries over to this solo album here. However, on top of being amazing with the drum set, his compositional skills are just as fantastic. This release here is a progressive, technical death metal release with a big portion of melodeath influence in the riffs and leads, as a lot of them tend to feel rather at the gates-esque in nature. In regards to those melodies, they are pretty amazing, being incredibly emotive and very catchy, and the riffs on this thing can have the same effect, though a lot of them cover some pretty heavy and relatively progressive territory as well. In any case, the overall songwriting on this thing ranges from beautifully melodic and emotive to intensely heavy to fairly intricate stuff, and combinations thereof. There are also a ton of pretty spicy guest solos on this thing on top of the already fantastic guitar work here, so that certainly helps out a lot of the tracks. In any instance, this thing is a pretty wonderful listen, especially if you're into progressive or melodic death metal, or if you happen to be a fan of Hans' work in other bands. For number 29, we have Cartoon Theory with Yokai's Orchestra, and this album here is definitely a bit more of a unique one in regards to this list. It is an interesting mix of primarily progressive metal and electronic, with inclusions of Japanese folk melodies and instrumentals thrown in. And on top of that, this album is entirely instrumental, leaving the electronics and lead guitars to carry the melodies on this thing, which are pretty spectacularly written at that. The melodies on here are pretty fantastic and varied, generally some very uplifting and good feels from them, and considering how catchy they all are, it works pretty well. As mentioned, some take decent influence from Japanese folk, which is always fun, and blending that in with the light, bouncy electronic melodies and the rapid prog metal-esque lead lines is both an interesting and really fun combination. The riffs on here vary along the same lines, tending to often be quite catchy and fun, though there are a few heavier moments in the riffing on some of the more metal-based tracks on here. Generally, the composition is more metal-focused, though there are a few tracks on here that are more so atmospheric, electronic mixed with Japanese folk, and those portions tend to be quite beautiful and calming, serving as a perfect juxtaposition to the metal compositions on the album. Performances on here are also pretty great, being quite technical, and there's some great progression in the writing as well. Overall, an extremely fun experience, and definitely my favorite instrumental album of the year, I would say. Next up, at number 28, we have Illusion Force with The World Soul. This here is a fairly pure J-Power album, and quite a high-quality one at that, having not only a wonderful sense of melody, but a good sense of intensity when necessary, coupled with some great variety to the songwriting. It also happens to be another album that I covered in a full review, so go feel free to watch that if you want some in-depth analysis of this thing. But in short, the melodies are all some top-quality J-Power melodies, ranging across a variety of emotion, but almost always invoking good feels of some sort or another, especially the motivational kind that power metal tends to do best. The riffs are pretty sick as well, being pretty damn intense and reasonably catchy a lot of the time, though a lot of the focus is put into the leads and the vocals as you'd expect, both of which are great. Songwriting on here, as mentioned, has some nice variety. You've even got some ballads on here which are unironically very good, which is generally rare for power metal. And aside from that, there's some nice, slightly folky influence to certain portions, some neat electronic bits that tie in with the album theme and the atmosphere. Overall, it's quite a good time. Definitely recommend you check out the album, and if you're not convinced, then maybe go watch my review to get a better idea of it. At number 27, there is Reader of the Runes, Divination by Elvenking, which is a folk power metal album from a relatively well-known band considering the genre in question. And so far as folk power metal goes, this album blends the two elements very well. And on that front, the songwriting incorporates some good variety too, evidently using a ton of great folk instrumentals, but also throwing in some black metal elements on rare occasions. As far as the songwriting goes on this thing, it is generally quite consistent, though there are a few tracks here that definitely stand out quite a bit more as far as I am concerned. And as far as diversity to songwriting goes, the songs on here cover a nice bit of ground, tend not to retread things too much, everything being fairly distinct. The main feature here is definitely the melodies, which are generally fantastic, being very catchy and very emotive. The riffs on here blend power metal and folk metal quite well, and tend to be quite memorable and catchy too, and all the performances on this thing are pretty stellar, especially the vocals. Overall, not a lot to say on this one, but it is absolutely a recommended release, fairly straightforward, but extremely enjoyable. For number 26, we have In Mourning with Garden of Storms, a relatively well-known progressive melodic death metal band fairly similar in style to Insomnium, likely having taken some decent influence from them on top of that. And as someone who has heard a few In Mourning releases in the past, I would be pretty comfortable classifying this album as their best release so far. This thing has a great overall atmospheric presence, helping to amplify the emotional intensity of the melodies and riffs. The songwriting is pretty great on here, having a really good sense of progression and melody, somehow making the riffs and melodies so impactful and catchy, in fact, that despite the average track runtime on here being roughly 7 minutes, the songs feel like they flow by so quickly. It's pretty easy to get lost in the enjoyment of these songs, and it basically feels like nothing gets repetitive whatsoever on here, which is great. As for the aforementioned melodies and riffing, they're all pretty damn catchy and generally really evocative, more often than not having some pretty great impact to them as well, tending to being either spicy and aggressive, more mournful, or serene and beautiful, all feelings which translate quite well from the music here. Overall, a spectacular album, definitely one of the best in the genre, and absolutely one of the coolest releases from the year. Next at number 25, we get Khora by Monolithe, which is a fairly interesting concept album. The band have a fairly varied style, primarily what I would describe as progressive funeral doom, with some melodeath elements in there as well. And so far as the songwriting on here goes, it is fantastic in regards to both quality and diversity. Covering the latter, this thing delves into all genres the band normally does, but also includes some fairly jazzy elements, having some decent use of saxophone on here, as well as other interesting instrumental inclusions like a fairly noticeable flute and a cello. The riffs on this thing are absolutely fantastic, tons of very memorable and catchy moments throughout, lots of standout melodies that help keep you enraptured, and the rhythm section absolutely kicks ass on here. Atmospherically, this release is just as good, having a great atmosphere that swathes over the whole of the album like a dense fog, making it very easy to get lost in and giving that definite emotional drive to the album that you love to hear. Overall, this thing feels great and is such a top-tier listening experience. As for the aforementioned concept shenanigans, this thing is pretty interesting in that all the tracks are either 4 or 8 minutes and 4 or 8 seconds long, with there being 8 tracks on top of that, the full album being exactly 48 minutes long, which essentially means that the band were writing under set time limits just for the sake of it, I suppose, which is interesting. But I don't feel that the songwriting suffers from it either. If you want to know more about the album's concept, though, the band has a bunch of stuff up on their YouTube for it, so you can go check that out. In any case, though, this is an amazing album and a highly recommended listen. For number 24, we have Mana by Idle Hands, and this is another pretty interesting release here, primarily when taking into account that the band blends together goth rock and traditional heavy metal, with a vocalist who sounds like they wouldn't at all be out of place in Joy Division or The Cure, and the surprisingly apt mix of the emotive gothic vibes with the catchy riffing from trad metal. The band does a surprisingly good job at making quite a unique experience, whilst still having quite a nostalgic, old-school sound to it. So as you would expect, the writing on this thing is pretty damn great, otherwise I probably wouldn't be talking about it. It's got super catchy melodies, lots being pretty comparable to Iron Maiden. It's got a pretty emotive atmosphere, and everything on here certainly evokes some good feels. It doesn't stray away from the cheese either, which I think is definitely a good thing for a style like this, but everything on here is done so well that it's hard not to take the musicality seriously. Hell, even a song that is literally titled Dragon, Why Do You Cry, which from the title one would assume to be a horrible power metal ballad or something of the sort, is an extremely compelling listen. Overall, quite a top-tier release, especially if you're looking for some throwbacks. Then at 23, we get Saor with Forgotten Paths, which is primarily a black metal release, though the band does tend towards a lot of folk implementations, and I believe that this band is fairly well known at that, so this probably isn't too surprising of a pick considering how fantastic the songwriting is on this album. The melodies are outright fantastic on this thing, evoking some wonderful emotion and beauty, images of sweeping mountains and valleys, all of that lovely imagery that tends to come along with extremely well done Scottish folk music, which is unabashedly embraced on this album. Blending that with some more black metal-y riffs and occasionally more black metal-esque melodies tends to only strengthen the overall atmosphere, everything entwining wonderfully into a very tight release here. The vocals on this are also pretty fantastic, some great shrieks that really help accentuate the atmosphere, and some lovely female cleans on occasion help pique the sense of beauty felt on this album. Definitely a fantastic release, especially if you're looking for some beautiful, atmospheric folk black metal. At number 22, we have The Weakness of Virtue by Soulmass, which, believe it or not, is another album that I did a full review on, link in the description if you're curious. But anyways, this here is a pretty damn great Death Doom album with some progressive elements to it. And interestingly enough, this album is themed around the game series Dark Souls, as is the band in general, which makes sense if you consider the name. And overall, the album does a very good job at capturing the feel of the series, which is overall quite crushing and desolate, I would say. Speaking of crushing, the riffs on this thing are amazing and generally very heavy, and they tend to be pretty damn memorable on top of that. It is quite rare to find a track on here that has sections that don't consist of sick as fuck riffs, as a matter of fact, though generally whenever that is the case, it's due to a more atmospheric approach, the intro to the final track of the album being a great example of that. The atmosphere is again pretty fitting to the theme that the album takes here and is pretty all-encompassing, especially helped out by the great production on this thing. As far as the lead lines and other less riffy melodies go, such aspects are done pretty well here too, since this thing has some spectacular melody lines on the leads at times, as well as some great solo-like sections, which are pretty spectacular. On the more rare side of things, there are also some more calm melodic sections on this thing, and such moments tend to invoke a stunning amount of beauty and serenity, which is a great lead-in to the generally desolate atmosphere. In any case, pretty fucking fantastic release here, highly recommend that you check it out, and if you're not convinced or want to know more, I would totally suggest that you go watch my full review on it. For number 21, we have Smoulder with Times of Obscene Evil and Wild Daring. Considering the band play in a more traditional heavy metal and USPM-based style, mixed with epic doom metal, I definitely think that comparing them as a more doom metal-oriented Eternal Champion isn't too inaccurate, especially considering the opening track on here is in fact based on Moorcock's works, which is probably the reason that the comparison comes so readily to mind. Though, aside from the differential of doom metal elements, I should also note that the vocalist here is female and absolutely fantastic at that. Her voice has a very powerful tone that fits the style practically perfectly, and she's evidently quite skilled on top of that. Furthermore, a lot of the vocal lines on here are damn good, not only being excellently performed, but very well written and often extremely catchy. Though the same goes for pretty much the entirety of this album, since all the riffs and leads on here are spectacular, having a great sense of heaviness and melody, being very memorable and entertaining. And the overall atmosphere on here is pretty great on top of that. If you're looking for more spectacular, old-school styled metal, then this is definitely one amazing release to look into. At number 20, we have something almost totally different, for we have To the Ether by A Million Dead Birds Laughing. So this release is probably best characterized as a mix of technical death metal, grindcore, and dark ambient, a rather unique blend, and as you can probably tell, a fairly intense one at that. The songwriting on here is fantastic, the more intensive tech death grindcore sections being very chaotic, yet evidently quite deliberate, everything flowing extremely well, and the more ambient portions being rather haunting, balancing between serene and unsettling. Thanks to that, the atmosphere on this thing is essentially always present and very emotive and captivating at that, definitely functioning as one of the main features. Plus, the melodies used in the ambient sections share the traits of the atmosphere, serving to further enhance it. In regards to the more death grindy sections, though, there is a definite focus on the riffing, and both the riffs and leads on here are pretty great, being fairly memorable, sometimes bridging into much more melodic or much more dissonant territory, so there's a pretty good variety to them as well. And as mentioned, these sections are definitely a lot more intense and chaotic, as you would hope, so the versatility to that chaos definitely helps. Altogether, this thing manages to blend a lot of interesting territory into a great album shaped by fantastic songwriting. Certainly recommend checking it out. For number 19, we have Hath with Of Rot and Ruin, a progressive blackened death metal album that is pretty fire. Also, a preemptive fun fact, though I wasn't aware of this at first, when I actually went to take a look at the lyrics, I realized that this album seems to have a lot of songs based around Dark Souls. So that's pretty damn cool, but aside from that, the music on this thing is absolutely great. Firstly, the riffs on this thing are heavy and catchy as fuck, definitely being one of the driving forces of the album. There are tons of memorable riffs throughout this, with some definite intensity to them, and on top of that, they help keep up with the relatively dark atmosphere on this release, which is great in its own right. So far as the lead lines and other melodies on this thing go, they are also pretty great. Some of the solos on here are fantastically done, and many of the melodies can be extremely catchy as well. The overall songwriting also has quite a nice progressive leaning to it, so there's some great variety to each song on here. And on top of that, the black metal elements they use on here are blended extremely well into the predominant death metal in the songwriting, boosting that extremity and overall dark vibe, and naturally helping out with the more melodic sections in regards to maintaining intensity and having the melodies shine through more. Vocals on here are great and relatively varied. There are these melodic pseudo-harsh vocals that get used every so often that are extremely fucking catchy, and the overall performances on this thing are really good, rather technical a lot of the time as well. Amazing release here, especially if you're looking for some thick, spicy riffs. Up next at number 18, we have Dimhav with The Boreal Flame, a progressive power metal album with some fairly predominant and very well integrated use of symphonics and lots of keyboard as you would expect. And so far as that goes, this release does it pretty damn well, sharing the same epic vibes to their compositions as Lost Horizon, and with some decent stylistic influence from them, I would say this thing has a pretty big focus on grandiose composition, with over half of the tracks on this album being longer than 9 minutes, the closing track being the longest. The second longest track on here is the opener, and it is almost exclusively instrumental, and yet despite that, it is not only incredibly compelling, but extremely catchy and memorable. And interestingly enough, it does an amazing job of making the vocals even more impactful on the rest of the album when they do come into play. As mentioned earlier, the symphonic portions are blended into the songwriting really well on here, and that songwriting is pretty spectacular, having some lovely variety and progression whilst overall staying extremely memorable. There are tons of great riffs on this thing, more so than you'd usually get out of power metal, all interwoven with fantastic orchestrals, amazing lead lines, and fantastic vocal melodies. The entire thing giving off such an emotive vibe and a very inspirational one at that. Speaking of, the atmosphere on this thing is surprisingly effective for power metal as well, only complemented by the incredibly well-written and memorable melodies on here. If you're a power metal fan, then this is totally a must-listen. For a turn in direction, at number 17, we have Voice by Warforged, a progressive technical black metal band with some death metal elements on here. The death metal elements primarily incorporated in some of the heavier riffing on this album. And this thing definitely has some top quality riffs, though first I'd like to go over the songwriting on this thing and just how interesting and unique both that and the overall sound are. Because this album definitely sounds very unique, being a very black metal-esque take on technical death metal, though at the same time a lot more avant-garde in nature than something like Singularity per se, since the album has a huge focus on atmosphere, and lots of the riffing ends up feeling quite dissonant and chaotic. In regards to the heavy atmosphere on this thing, it is quite evocative, being very mysterious and dense, chaotic and anxious, overall a very interesting mood and a very captivating one at that. There are some more serene moments on this thing too, since it tends to have a few very well done acoustic sections and interludes and more ambient passages, though this serenity is tempered by an ever-present feeling of dread. The melodies on here serve to greatly further the atmosphere, taking on more of a black metal-esque approach in that regard, though there are some occasional lead lines and solos that are more for technical show and memorability than anything, which they do quite well. There is also a fantastic sense of progression on this thing, since there's a ton of variety to the songwriting here, almost no repetition at all, some interesting variety not already touched upon in both the piano inclusions and the jazzier sections, and thanks to that, this thing has a ton of replayability. Back to the riffing, there's also some great variety, some again being more dissonant and chaotic, some being very heavy, some being more technical, some covering more melodic ground, lots of diversity to it. And considering all these aspects blend spectacularly well, this thing is absolutely one of the coolest metal albums of the year. Next, over here at number 16, we have Equipoise with Demiurgus, a progressive technical death metal band with quite a decent focus on the more melodic side of technical death metal, which means an absolute fuck ton of shredding on this album. And to add more intrigue, the entire thing is based around Full Metal Alchemist, which is a bit more niche than you would expect from death metal, but I'm glad that we get some weeb representation in the scene, especially from such an amazing album. I feel like saying that this album is about 50% solos would be more accurate than most would assume, and considering the solos on this thing consist of some absolutely fantastic technical shredding with some amazing sense of melody and a variety of influence, including lots of neoclassical shredding mixed in, it is a very good time. That being said, though, the rest of the songwriting absolutely does not slack on this thing. Being fairly similar to Obscura in style and sound, the band has a strong bass presence, some sick riffs and spicy vocals, and most importantly, some very clear and very quality melodic lead lines throughout. The songwriting shows some great progression and variety, having a pretty nice diversity of influence throughout, as well as including some more jazzy sections, great orchestral use, some very nice acoustic passages, flamenco use sometimes, and a ton of neoclassical piano used throughout the album, which complements things very well, and naturally there's very little repetition as well. There's also practically an army of guest musicians on this thing, which is pretty synonymous with the tons and tons of amazing technical solos and the diversity amidst those solos. Absolutely stellar technical death metal release, and definitely a prime exemplar for the genre. The next release on this list, number 15, is a pretty interesting and varied album, that album being Vesica Piscis by the Odious. So this release is a blend of progressive metal, death metal, grindcore, and other influences including funk and jazz and psych and prog rock. There's a lot of stuff in here to say the least. In spite of the varied influence, though, the sound on this thing is relatively consistent, and all of the songwriting is certainly quite cohesive. There's a lot of great progression to the songs on here, some nice use of motifs throughout the album, which is always fun to see, especially when said motifs are as catchy as the ones on here are. As far as the riffs and leads go on this thing, they are generally pretty spectacular and pretty varied overall, again drawing from the wide range of influences mentioned earlier and tending towards an array of different emotions. You've got some heavier moments, more chaotic sections, very serene and calming portions, lots of variety to them, and all done very well. The riffs are pretty great and generally quite heavy, with the more proggy ones tending to be pretty memorable, and generally the melodies on this thing are fantastically catchy. There's some good variety to the vocals on here too, there's a lot of interconnectivity and diversity to the tracks on here. Overall, it's a very high-quality progressive metal album with a lot of great blended influence and some fantastic songwriting, and a fairly weird and unique take on things, which is pretty appreciable overall. For number 14, we have Dream Troll with Second to None, and a fairly more straightforward release than the last. This album here is a pretty high-quality blend of traditional heavy metal and power metal, being very on board with the whole trad metal revival movement that's going on, though with a pretty present AOR vibe to it. Though overall, what makes Dream Troll in particular stand out to me at least is how absolutely fantastic and memorable their melodies are. The production on this album is a lot more clean than you would expect from trad power metal, though it, interestingly enough, doesn't seem to take away from the strength of the riffs or rhythm sections on here at all, which I think is mostly thanks to this album being pretty high up in tempo and having a ton of lead melodies played over top of the less intensive riffs, which generally means the sound is so busy that the production doesn't need to be incredibly dense to be effective, and the more clean nature of it actually helps with a lot of the faster leads and riffs on here. As far as the leads and riffs go, though, this thing is quite uplifting on that front. Though the speed for many of them makes for a lot of inherent intensity, the melody behind all of the compositions on this thing tends to be so absurdly catchy and memorable that you can't help but focus on them. And again, the melodies on here are generally very power metal-esque, being very driving and fun, invoking those good inspirational feels. As for the slower portions on the album, such as with The Art of Death, there is a surprisingly present and fairly effective atmosphere to help carry the sound through, and it works surprisingly well. There are some progressive tinges to some of the tracks on here, as you'd expect with a lot of the song lengths, and they generally work really well, though a lot of the structure is more so standard to maximize the effectiveness of all these absurdly catchy verses and choruses, which is definitely not a bad thing. On top of that, there's also some top-tier solos on this thing, showing off some nice technical skill to back some really great melody lines. Altogether, an infectiously catchy release and a very well-written album. And now for the third Dark Souls-based album in this video. At number 13 we have Firelink with The Inveterate Fire. I absolutely do not know what it is with extreme metal musicians and being capable of making such amazing songs based around Dark Souls, but here we have yet another example of it. this time in the form of what is primarily melodic black metal, though with aspects of death metal and progressive metal blended in. And this is a fantastic release so far as melodic black metal goes, with amazing atmosphere, amazing riffs, high quality leads, and overall top tier melodies, all thrown into some diverse and interesting songwriting. And despite the darker vibes of the Dark Souls series, the atmosphere on this thing is surprisingly comfy, but it still maintains the bleak nature of the games. There's definitely a feel of vastness and a somewhat desolate feeling to the atmosphere here, but at the same time it feels comforting for some reason, which is an interesting dynamic that's difficult to explain, but I really, really like it. The riffs on here are great, some quality heaviness and intensity, and they tend to be very emotive as well, which helps the mood of things. The melodies are all fantastic, as mentioned, some super catchy and memorable stuff, and they are generally either very intense to match the more extreme metal sections, or surprisingly serene and beautiful in either the more atmospheric sections or the more emotional portions on the album here. The band uses a lot of acoustic interludes and such, which help blend the atmosphere into the intensity, and they keep things intertwined very well, serving as excellent transitional moments a lot of the time. Somewhat reminiscent of Opeth in that, right, with the atmosphere on top of that. Quite a nice time. But yeah, overall, some more fantastically written Dark Souls-based metal, and definitely one of the best black metal albums of last year. At number 12, we have Serpent Column with Mirror in Darkness, and this thing is probably one of the most avant-garde things on the list, if not the most outright. So far as classifying this thing outside of that, though, this release incorporates elements of black metal, math rock, progressive metal, and the more dissonant side of technical death metal, all to produce one absurdly chaotic, tumultuous, intensive, and memorable experience. Both the production and atmosphere on this thing are very dense, only serving to further magnify the chaos on here, since the swathe of atmosphere and the dense, grittier production make the already intense riffs even more impactful, and the technical skill that the band carries through here makes everything even more precise, which works very well in regards to forging some great dissonance with the riffs. The lead melodies on here are practically stunning when they actually come through, acting almost like a beacon in the storm as they cut through the surrounding chaos, making them incredibly impactful in the moment, and even outside of that, the melodies on here are pretty great, reasonably memorable, and very fitting to the songs, especially blending well with the atmosphere. This album does have some calmer moments as well, where we get some nice serene breaks from all the high intensity that is predominant with the songwriting here. The more acoustic, progressive, math rocky sections are pretty fantastic, and at heights of intensity, this thing essentially goes into pure noise, which it juxtaposes and blends very well with everything else. Overall, an absolutely fantastic avant-garde black metal album with some great mixed influence. Then at number 11, we have Zero Gravity by Turilli, Lione, Rhapsody. So the newest iteration of one of the most well-known symphonic power metal bands takes a bit of a step up from the previous works Luca has done with Rhapsody and Rhapsody of Fire, though this does act somewhat as a continuation of his sound on Luca Turilli's Rhapsody. And if you're getting confused with the amount of different Rhapsodies here, don't worry, so am I. Disregarding all that, at least, though, this album is primarily symphonic power metal, though with some progressive metal mixed in with the songwriting. I will start off with stating that the vocals on this thing are fantastic, some incredible operatic vocals from Fabio Lione, who is pretty well known in power metal, though this is easily one of his absolute best performances, a practically stunning one a lot of the time. The guitar work on here is also fantastic, as Luca Turilli is one of the best neoclassical guitarists out there, and certainly one of the absolute best in power metal. And thankfully this translates into the songwriting just as well, since the riffs on this thing are pretty great. And the lead lines, solos, and melodies across the board are amazing, incredibly well written, fusing progressive and neoclassical tendencies with power metal for a great effect in both keeping things very memorable and very impressive. And the symphonic portions of the album are pretty great here as well and show some decent variety. On top of that, there's a decent amount of electronic usage on here, as well as some more folky passages, lots of sonic diversity overall, which helps differentiate the compositions quite easily. While I would say that there's a bit of overkill with the more ballady parts of the album taking up quite a bit of the runtime, these sections are still fantastic, not only thanks to the great composition, but again, the vocals being so perfectly suited to such ballads, making some of these portions even highlights of the album, which is incredibly rare for the genre. Definitely an amazing release, though, by some of the best musicians in power metal, certainly something to look into. And that is all that I will cover for this video. If you have any thoughts on my decisions here, leave a comment below. If you want to check out any of these albums, I have links in the description. And if you enjoyed your time, feel free to leave a like and subscribe, not only for similar content centered around high-quality metal music, but more of this list right here, since I will be uploading the top 10 portion as soon as I can. Also, feel free to follow my social media. I'm not extremely active there, but I do post more updates and whatnot. And if you want to interact with me outside of YouTube, then those are some pretty quick and easy solutions to that. As always, I have been Empyrean Serpent, and thank you for your time.